Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today we're going to kick off a two-part series where we're going to address something we get a lot of questions about. One of the challenges in church is that we are trying to speak to what it looks like to honor God with all of His resources, but we are speaking to an audience that has a lot of different circumstances that they're facing. And one of the problems the church has always had when it comes to this particular topic of financial stewardship is we are aiming one message at three entirely different audiences. And so we tend to be afraid to dive into it because it doesn't feel like it applies to everybody in the same way. It's hard to give really practical direction because not everybody can do what we're talking about or depends on the circumstance. And so we just kind of avoid it. And that's part of the problem. The church needs to get into this conversation. We need to be leading this discussion. We don't want to leave it to the financial news media and the gurus out there to drive this conversation. We want to step into leadership in our individual communities and give them direction. It is a healthy thing to do. And so one of the questions we get from the people who are trying to do that is, how do I do that? How do I address these three totally different situations in a way that makes sense? In a good sense, we think we have solved this problem by allowing the church to engage in one big conversation together, because the 6 ideas that we teach in our Freed Up app apply to everybody, no matter what their circumstance is. That a faithful steward is what we're trying to aim at, that we don't claim ownership of any of this stuff. It's all God's. But a faithful steward is a diligent earner, a prudent spender, a generous giver, a wise saver, and a cautious debtor. Those are the 6 ideas. But how they apply, how they directly impact the family that is going through the program depends on the situation that family is facing. And that's why I love that process of Freed Up, because it has really fixed this issue that we see over and over again in communities. You have lane 1 individuals or families. They are in trouble and they know it. They're struggling, they're striving, they're failing in a lot of ways to make ends meet, and they are panicked and scared, and they feel a lot of shame around money. They feel like they have failed, and they don't need to be beat up. They don't need to be scolded or shamed. They already feel shame. They actually need hope. They need a path to stability. They need to get to a place where they feel like their feet are finally standing on solid ground. And that takes a lot of encouragement and thoughtful communication. Then you have lane 2. Those are the people who are in trouble, but they don't know it. They think all they need to do is pay their bills and they're fine, but they're not growing their net worth. They're spending beyond their means. They're in many cases building up credit card debt to keep up with the Joneses, and they're medicating pain that they don't understand with money they don't have. And those are different conversations. In a lot of cases, lane 2 does need a little bit of tough love. They need to be woken up a little bit. They need to be aware that they are not honoring the owner of the resources with the way they're managing it. And then you have lane 3. Those are people who aren't in trouble. They tend to accumulate really well. They're really good with money. They earn really well. And they find their significance, their status, their power, as well as their security in the money they're accumulating. And so this is the problem. The church looks at those 3 audiences and says, how do we communicate to them? How do we lead them? And that really is an issue, and I understand it. If you are a stewardship pastor, if you have been having conversations with families, one of the things that I really want us to work on over these next couple podcasts is how do we engage these different situations? How do we meet somebody who's in lane 1 and give them what they need? How do we meet with somebody who's in lane 2 and call them to clarity, give them a path that helps them understand what's happening and gives them awareness of where they are not honoring the Lord. And then how do we engage with lane 3 without asking them for more money, without making it about just getting more from them, but actually calling them to faithful stewardship that releases them into honoring God in all the ways that they manage his resources, not just when they're giving to our church, right? Those are the challenges that I want to address in these next couple of podcasts. And so if you are a leader and you're having these conversations, or you're a financial coach in your church and a ministry that is meeting with families, this is what we're going to unpack over the next couple of episodes. And I hope it's really helpful, but please don't hesitate to email me with any questions or any particular circumstances that have got you stuck, because I really want us to get good at this. I would love to see the church be the place where families are turning to wrestle with the heart condition, the discipleship issues that money presents, that they would not be going just to financial news or to, guru books, but they would actually be seeking guidance from spiritual directors, from people who are aiming them at Jesus, giving them some ways to hold on to some handles that let them know that they are actually honoring God in this way. When we solve some of those issues, a lot of the practical things that the gurus are talking about solve themselves as well. But if we don't figure out why they're in the situation that they're in, if we don't have enough patience and kindness and warmth towards them in their circumstance, and we're not addressing the circumstance they're actually facing, then we end up leaving them no choice but to just go towards the practical, and they miss the heart issues and the discipleship issues that are actually causing those practical problems. So let's dive in to lane 1. If you are meeting with a family in a coaching circumstance, or you're speaking to a community of lane 1 individuals or families, what we want to make sure we know first and foremost is that they already feel terrible about themselves. We don't need to pour salt in that wound. We don't need to make it worse by asking them questions that are aimed really at shutting them down. Things like, why would you do that? Or how did you get in this mess? Or what did you think would happen when you did that? Those kinds of questions already become this avalanche of shame on something that they already feel terribly shameful about. And so one of the most important things about engaging with a lane 1 family is loving them enough to not ask them how they got here. And I know that seems counterintuitive. We need to know how they got here. We need to know what happened. We actually don't. A lot of times in that circumstance, someone wants to explain to you that it was my ex-boyfriend that caused all this. They co-signed for this, or I co-signed for a car loan with them, and then they got repoed and it ruined my credit. They want to unpack for you why what they're in makes sense. But the problem with that is it's only rehashing all of their pain, and it's convincing them they can't escape it. And so we don't want to spend a lot of time reminiscing on their past mistakes. It's not helpful. It's their natural bent. It's what they want to do. But I would encourage you as leader to shut that down. In fact, I've been in some of those conversations, and I will tell the person, I love you too much to talk about this. I know you think this is valuable. I don't care. We are where we are. And now the question is, what are we doing next? I actually don't need to know what happened to get you here. What I'm more concerned about is what we're going to do differently going forward. And so let's focus on the future. Let's turn our eyes towards what's coming and what we're going to choose to do, rather than blaming ourselves, shaming ourselves, or blaming others so that we don't have to feel as much shame about how we got here in the first place. That is not a useful exercise. And it is a waste of our time together as coaches, as mentors. If we're pastoring them, I know it feels like we should sit in that with them, but it's actually the opposite. We should move on. We should get them moving forward. One of the hardest things for lane 1 to understand is how much we'll need to change. Many times in that lane 1 situation, we see that they have gotten a fair amount of debt in place. Maybe they're behind. Maybe they've had some collections. They are in a situation where they are chasing their tail and trying to overcome their past mistakes, but their biggest hurdle is just not making new ones. And a lot of times, in order to set them up for success, we need to go with a really extreme response to their situation. It may be that we need to think in terms of kind of a scorched earth approach. You've got to sell the car. You've got to get out of that apartment. You got to move to a cheaper place. You've got to change your living circumstances. Maybe you need to move back in with your parents, right? These things that they don't even put on the table as options because they feel so painful and so embarrassing. We need to encourage them to consider them and recognize they can't do enough in the cutting on the edges to really get to a place of stability, because they need to move really big rocks and free up really substantial income in order to be able to actually make progress quickly. And so a lot of times with lane one, the reason why they can't find their way to stability is because they're not moving big enough rocks to actually create margin that would lead to that stability. And so we don't need to hear how they got here. And we also don't want them to stay where they are. But staying where they are is the default mode, because they're just spinning plates. They're just trying to keep their bills paid. They're just trying to make enough to not go late on their utility bill or go late on, their phone bill. Those kinds of problems don't resolve themselves by spending $5 less here or $5 less there. We need to move a big rock, and then we need to capture that margin and use it to start to pay off these things, get things caught up, and really get to a place where stability becomes a real opportunity for them. Most of the time, they've not done that, which is why they're still stuck in this place that feels chaotic and scary and uncertain. This is also a place where we need to get really intentional about how we coach them on tracking and understanding their reality. And so if they are in a situation where they are getting a subsidy, let's say they've got rental assistance or a SNAP allowance for food, they need to think of those things as incomes in order to know what their life actually costs. A lot of times when I coach families in lane one, they don't really know what it takes to make their life work because they're not tracking it. And if they are tracking it, they're tracking the net expense, the subsidized level. My rent is $500 a month. No, it's not. Your rent is $1,500 a month, but you have a $1,000 subsidy. Or my grocery bill is X amount dollars a month. Well, that's after you take into account the fact that you've got that SNAP benefit. We need to make sure we're coaching these families to understand the full reality they're facing. Their life costs them much more than they think it does, which is why they're always confused why just a small tweak here or there doesn't seem to fix it. They need to really dig in and track and understand exactly what their life costs. We have no path to stability for them if we don't understand what their actual life costs are. And so we really need to take the time to coach them up on that tracking skill, being able to really know what their actual numbers look like so that we know what we're changing and how long we need to make those sacrifices. So if it's, hey, you're going to have to move back into your parents' basement for this amount of time, and if you capture these dollars over this amount of time, you can see we'll be able to catch up on these things. It should take you 9 months if we do this right. So let's start setting out for them these targets that give them a clear path for how long these sacrifices need to be made, but they also, for the first time maybe in their life, understand why they need to be made, because you can't get there with these other rounding error changes. We got to move something significant. So that's lane one. It is encouraging. It's hopeful. It's aspirational. The communication we're having with these families is you can do this. You are capable because they don't believe they are. You are skilled and talented, and you are able to navigate this thing that has terrified you and scared you. You actually are bigger than this. You can make this happen. You need to give them that kind of encouragement, because most of what they're hearing from the gurus and other leaders and other people they talk to is, you're terrible at this. You've done this wrong. You've messed this up. You can't recover. And those kinds of messages are so self-defeating. We need to flip the script and give them a path of hope and encouragement, but clarity on what it actually takes in order to find stability in their life. Lane 2 is a different conversation. Lane 2, when you're coaching those families, they have enough resources. They are making enough money, but they have defined success mostly in the definition of paying their bills, that their cash flow is covering their costs. Their income and their expenses are close enough to each other. Maybe they're a little bit negative each month, but not by much, because they've stacked up credit card debt or they've stacked up financing on different things they've bought, but they're not paying attention to where it's going or why. They don't fully understand what they're actually creating in terms of the future that they're facing, because they think success looks like my budget is managed. They don't understand net worth. They don't recognize that they're not preparing for future obedience. They're not building for a future that allows them to say yes when the owner of the resources asks them to do something. We need to make sure we change their understanding, their paradigm of what success looks like. It's way more important than just paying your bills. It's building a solid foundation for the future so that you're able to be obedient in that future. You're not scared. You're not running from a scarcity mindset. The other thing they need to do is recognize that they're continuing to make the same decisions that fill their cash flow up. So they allow their lifestyle to chase their income, which means their income has to continue to chase their lifestyle, and they just keep ramping each of those up. And they're constantly under pressure. They have no margin in their life. They are running at absolute max heart rate all the time to keep all these things afloat. And they think they're succeeding, but they're failing. And so the lane 2 conversation is a little bit more of a tough love kind of discussion. It is waking them up to the fact that this won't work. They will eventually hit the wall. At some point, their income is going to cap out and their lifestyle is going to keep growing. At some point, this thing flips on itself, and we better get ahead of it and start getting used to having margin. This particular conversation with lane 2 is where I bring in that concept that the hardest part of money is the having of it, building it up and letting it sit there, not letting our brains tell us all the things we could be doing with it, all the stuff we could spend our money on, all the ways we could enjoy or have shared experience, or we need to just let it be and stop allowing this discontent that we're being bombarded with from all sides to get into our hearts. We've got to grow into a place where we find contentment and peace, and we allow that money to grow and accumulate for future obedience rather than spending it as soon as we have it. So one of the most critical differences I see between lane 1 and lane 2 is lane 1 is in crisis now, and lane 2 will be in crisis eventually. They're making it work. They're figuring it out right now, but they're not feeling the level of shame and failure. They feel like they're doing pretty well, but they will hit the wall and eventually they will face a crisis. And if we wake them up now, we can get them to avoid the pain that's coming. And so we do want to give them a little bit of a shake. And most of the time, this is rooted in them getting to a place of clarity, understanding what it is that keeps motivating these buying decisions. What are you trying to buy? Is it status? Is it significance? Is it a sense of value or worth? Those are all things that we tend to medicate with money we don't have if we're not careful. And so we need to know what's driving those decisions. We also need to really hone in on this lack of intentionality we see a lot of times. Lane 2 families will say, we spend less than we make, so it's fine. We need to call them to a higher level of accountability to the owner of the resources. It's not enough to just say you spent less than you made. What did you do with it? Where did it go? If you don't know, I don't believe that is faithful stewardship. It's just that you're spending less than what came in, but you still don't know how you honored or if you honored the owner of the resources with his stuff. And so we want to really hone in on why we're tracking. It's not just to make sure we're not in trouble, but it's also to make sure we're making decisions intentionally ahead of time. What are we going to spend in these categories? The spending plan is such a gift to lane 2. Deciding ahead of time what we will spend, then having the freedom to do exactly what we said we would do. We don't need to restrict and self-loathe when we do spend money we planned on spending. But we do need to make sure that when we're spending it, it's because we decided to before we actually took out our wallets. If we're making these decisions in the moment, emotionally, reacting to a marketing message, reacting to an urge that we have that is mostly rooted in medicating whatever that pain, that motivation is that we tend to use, we will continue to make unintentional, emotional decisions around money, and that is not faithful stewardship. Lane 2 also needs to be called to deciding what is enough. More is always better. Just a little bit more is the tendency that we see in a lot of Lane 2s. In their case, that little bit more is spending. In Lane 3's case, a little bit more is related to hoarding, over-accumulating, and over-saving. It's the same coin. It's just two sides. A little bit more stuff in Lane 2 and a little bit more money and security and power in Lane 3. So we want to make sure we call them to a level of decision around what enough looks like. What is contentment? Draw the lifestyle cap, say this far, no further, and then live within that restriction, because that is peace and delight and beauty. It's all in there. Lifestyle cap does not mean restriction to a point of misery. We are putting the things in we're choosing, but we're choosing ahead of time, and then we're drawing the line and saying that's enough. This is the kind of aspirational coaching Lane 2 needs. So Lane 1 needs to be told they can do it and they're capable, and this is how we're going to do it, but it's going to take a big rock. Lane 2 needs to be woken up to the fact that they are not honoring the Lord with the work that they're doing, that they're not being faithful in their stewardship, but also an awareness that they don't have clarity around what's happening and where it's going, and it's there. It's available. There's enough. They just need to put some design around it, some structure, some intentionality in order to start to step into faithful stewardship and honor the Lord with his resources. So in Lane 1, the conversation is mostly around cash flow. How do we balance the ins and the outs? How do we get to a place where we can create some margin, get to some stability, and start to catch up on the things we're behind on? It's all cash flow. We're not worried at this point around building for the future and creating a net worth. At this point, it's about just trying to get out of the hole that we may have dug. Lane 2, they've somehow been able to not dig a giant hole, but they're not being effective. And so Lane 2 is more of a focus on building a net worth. Let's start actually aiming at progress, real meaningful progress. So let's get our emergency savings in place. Let's make sure we're building long-term savings, managing debt, cautiously approaching debt and minimizing our use of it. And more importantly, let's make sure we start stepping into generosity with that margin that we create. Let's start moving towards a tithe. Let's start stepping into what God has always been calling us to. One of the most valuable things the tithe does for Lane 2 is it gives them a fixed limit. If you are going to give 10%, that means everything else has to fit in 90. So we start to actually have the discipline of restricting ourselves instead of just spending everything that comes in. It's a beautiful gift that God has given us to give us the experience of denying ourselves all of it and starting to live within a boundary. And in Lane 2, we need to start building those boundaries so we can prepare for the future, building the net worth, and also today step into generosity. Generosity is not something that comes when your net worth is big. It comes right now. And it's rooted in drawing those lines and saying, this is enough. I don't need this much. And generosity is the joy that Lane 2 is missing. They think the joy is in spending. They think the joy is in buying more stuff and accumulating more things. Once they taste the joy of generosity, they don't tend to go back. They would rather experience generosity than more stuff. And then the restriction starts to have a meaning to it and a purpose to it rather than just denying themselves their own self-indulgence. So let's get super practical. If you are in these conversations with these families, whether they are Lane 1 or Lane 2, we want to be always leading with empathy and kindness and compassion. We want to be having conversations that are aspirational and hopeful and exciting. No judgment, no condemnation. We are not going to beat these people up. They have plenty of that to go around. We want to lead with great questions. Asking great questions is what unlocks their answers. And when it's their answer, they're more likely to do it. And when we step into these conversations where debt has become a burden, what we want them to do is recognize that debt is the symptom of the problem. It's not the problem. They have something in them that is driving them to use debt because it's less painful to pay the payments on the debt they took in than it is to actually face what they're really feeling and what they're trying to medicate. And if we let them believe that debt is the problem, they won't actually fix and face the real problem. They won't take what's in their heart to the Lord and ask Him to heal it. And so we end up in this cycle where they willpower their way into fixing their debt, and then it comes right back because the reason the debt is there never changed. And so we really want to make sure we're encouraging them to ask themselves and their family great questions on what's motivating these spending decisions so they recognize that it's their heart condition, their spiritual condition that's creating the debt. The debt is not actually the problem, it's the symptom. And so when we approach these conversations this way, they tend to stay more positive, more optimistic, and more specifically focused on the internal change in their heart and how they think about this stuff. And when we get that to change, the practical things change themselves. They still need blocking and tackling. They still need to know how to track and all that kind of stuff. But if we're only teaching the practical, they don't change their internal condition and they end up in the same places. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to help. Our team is always up for helping you coach your people better, grow them into faithful stewards, because that is what the kingdom needs. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.